Mr. Speaker, ministerial accountability is a fundamental principle of our political system. It means that ministers are accountable for the actions of the department they lead. With the job comes great responsibility. Does the Prime Minister believe that this principle, which allows people to trust their government, still applies to him and his cabinet? The Honourable Government House Leader. Yes. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-l'Érable. Well, we shall see, Mr. Speaker. On April 28th, the Minister of Public Safety stated that the Emergencies Act was only brought forward after police officials told the government that they needed this special power to restore public safety. Mr. Speaker, no police force has confirmed that they requested the Emergency Measures Act. Does the Prime Minister maintain, like his minister, that the police requested the act? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, we invoked the Emergencies Act in order to protect Canadian safety. It was the right thing to do. Commissioner Lucky testified that the Emergencies Measures Act gave the police the tools they needed in order to do our work quickly. Let's be clear, the government decided to invoke the act, but advice received was clear. We consulted with police forces, just as Commissioner Lucky said, about the powers under the Act on the emergency measures necessary. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-l'Érable. The Commissioner's comments were made after, not before, the invocation of the Act. Also on April 28th, the Minister of Public Safety said that it was only after hearing from the police that the government invoked the Act. The Prime Minister's entire story justifying the emergency legislation is hanging by a thread, and every police force has denied asking the federal government for it. Mr. Speaker, the Minister's words were clear and unequivocal. He cannot deny what he said. Did the Prime Minister himself or anyone in his entourage ask the Minister of Public Safety to use the police to justify invoking the Emergencies Act? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we understand very well what is necessary to protect Canadians' health and safety. And that is exactly why we invoke the Emergencies Act. And I'd like to know, when will the Conservatives understand all of the expenses having to do with these illegal blockades? It's very wrong.
I want to remind the honourable members that shouting out words that can't be said while questioning or answering questions, you're just as guilty, and if they get picked up, the individual members could get in trouble. Even if they are wearing a mask, I can tell who they are. The Honourable Member for Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it sounds like the Public Safety Minister has been studying Vladimir Putin's theory of revisionist history. The Public Safety Minister is misleading Canadians about why he took the unprecedented step of using the Emergency Act to implement martial law. To quote the Minister, and he said, "We invoked the Emergency Act on advice from the police." Well, it turns out the Ottawa City Police say they didn't ask for it. The RCMP say they didn't ask for it. The OPP said that they didn't ask for it. So did the Minister invent these facts to support his Liberal power grab?
Honourable Minister.
Speaker, I'm going to come to that, but just before I do, I want to call out the Honourable Member for using Mr. Putin in this chamber regarding the decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. It debases this place, it debases what's going on in Ukraine, and it is absolutely wrong, Mr. Speaker. He should be admonished for it. He should take back that comment. That's not what this chamber stands for.
The Honourable Member for Selkirk, Interlake.
The Minister wants to stand here and continue to deny that he's revising the history on the Emergencies Act, then he has to wear it.
That's right.
So the Minister is refusing to answer a simple question. Either the police asked for the Emergency Act or they didn't. Again, I'll quote the Minister's own words back to him. At the recommendation of police, we invoked the Emergency Act. Well, the Minister is refusing to repeat his own words in this chamber because he knows he misled the country and Canadians don't trust him. So, what's a new, unbelievable excuse the Minister is using today?
Honourable Minister.
Speaker, I want to be absolutely clear that we invoked the Emergencies Act because it was necessary to protect the health and safety of Canadians. You heard from Commissioner Lucky herself during her testimony before the committee, Mr. Speaker, that she said, quote, the Emergencies Act was necessary. It was necessary, Mr. Speaker, and I just wonder when the Conservatives are going to finally offer their sincere apologies to the residents of Ottawa who, during the protests, were encouraged to stay by the interim leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. It was wrong, wrong, wrong.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Public Safety has repeatedly claimed that on the recommendation of police, we invoke the Emergencies Act. Now, I know he likes to quote RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucky, so I hope he'll try this one on for size. Quote, there was never a question of invoking the Emergencies Act. Clearly, it wasn't an option considered by police. Now, the minister's saying what he really meant to say is that they consulted with police. His story's changing so often, it's no surprise that his deputy minister is saying he's misunderstood. How can Canadians trust this minister?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, what a prime example of cherry-picking the Commissioner's testimony. If he goes on to read, what he would see is that the Commissioner said in her own words that the Emergencies Act was needed to restore public safety, Mr. Speaker. And I'll tell you something, while he continues to bury his head on the sand on the material facts, while he continues to bury his head on the conduct of the interim leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, who egged on the illegal blockades long after it became a threat to public safety, we were working 24/7 with law enforcement to restore public safety. We will never apologize for that, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Sturgeon River, Parkland.
Well, Mr. Speaker, without parliamentary accountability, Canadians would never know the truth about how this Liberal government invoked the Emergencies Act. We were led to believe that protesters tried to burn down a building. False. We were led to believe that they were being funded with dark money. False. We were led to believe that they were planning to violently overthrow the government. False. The Minister of Public Safety even claimed that police asked for extraordinary powers to deal with the situation. False. With this much misinformation, it's no wonder Canadians' trust in government is at an all-time low. Will the minister take the first step in rebuilding this trust and apologize for misleading Canadians?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member talks about parliamentary accountability. I wonder whether or not it's true or false that it was parliamentarily reckless to say the following in the middle of the illegal occupation. In an email sent from the interim Conservative Party leader to her caucus, I don't think we should be asking them to go home. I understand the mood may shift soon, so we need to turn this into the PM's problem. In other words, a political problem. I wonder on this side, true or false, was that parliamentarily responsible? I don't think so, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for South Surrey, White Rock.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Public Safety keeps telling us that the government only invoked the Emergencies Act after it was requested by police. We know from testimony that the police never requested the Emergencies Act, just as we know the government has not been transparent on the Special Forces spy flight over the protest. None of this was necessary. How does this minister explain away his story being so different from senior police officials and his own deputy minister?
Wow. The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, during the illegal occupation and blockades of last winter, we saw Canadians put out of work. We saw families unable to take their children to school. We saw seniors unable to get around as a result of the illegal blockades. Mr.
I'm going to have to interrupt. Okay, I'll let the minister start from the top, please.
Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, in the middle of the illegal occupation, we saw Canadians put out of work. We saw families who were unable to take their kids to childcare. We saw an entire town here in Ottawa that was laid to siege. That's why we invoked the Emergencies Act, Mr. Speaker. And of course, we consulted. Of course, we sought the advice of police law enforcement because we understood that that was the best way to inform that decision. I wonder why the Conservative Party don't just stand up and accept their share of the responsibility for prolonging that illegal occupation as a result of the reckless abandon that they showed throughout.
The honourable member for West Surrey, White Rock.
Mr. Speaker, according to the government, the Special Forces spy flight over the Ottawa protest was just training. Wonder where that data went. The minister said the Emergencies Act was justified because of an attempted arson. Not so. And because the protest was significantly foreign funded. Also not so. And police never asked for the invocation of the Act. When will this government admit the Emergencies Act was a power grab overreach to stifle legitimate democratic dissent?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we have told this House many times, the flight in question was part of a Canadian Armed Forces training exercise that was planned prior to and was unrelated to the convoy protest, Mr. Speaker. This training had nothing to do with the blockade, the illegal blockade, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Wellington Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, the Emergencies Act can only be invoked when there is no other law to deal with the situation. It's not clear that this threshold was met. Members of the law enforcement community have said the threshold was not met, including Chris Lewis, the former commissioner of the OPP, Ontario's largest police force. So, when the public safety minister says that an unnamed police enforcement official made the request to invoke these powers, it's material. Mr. Speaker, a very simple question. Who is this unnamed police enforcement official?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member wants to quote law enforcement. Let me cite from the letter from the Canadian Association of the Chiefs of Police, who characterized the illegal blockades, and I'm saying right here from the language, unprecedented demonstrations, protests, occupations, and acts of civil disobedience. In other words, the likes of which have never seen before. I'm also quoting from the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, who said that the Emergency Economic Measures Order was critical to assisting law enforcement in addressing the mass national and international organization of the Freedom Convoy of 2022. How's that for law enforcement, Mr. Speaker?
For Wellington Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, the minister didn't answer the question. Suspending civil liberties is serious. That's why the Act can only be invoked when there is no law in Canada to deal with the situation. Right. That's why a committee of Parliament and a public inquiry must be established to determine whether or not the threshold for invocation was met. Yep. But for the committee and the inquiry to do its work, the government must be honest and forthright with its answers. This minister's answers are anything but. So, Mr. Speaker, a very simple question. This government came to office with a great deal of idealism. Does any remain?
The Honourable Minister.
There is no more paramount ideal than protecting Canadian safety, and that's why we invoke the Emergencies Act, Mr. Speaker. And I will tell you, we will always stand up for that decision. We will never apologize for doing what is necessary to protect Canadians who were besieged by the unprecedented act of civil disobedience, in the words of the most senior officials of law enforcement in this country. Of course we will cooperate with the Parliamentary Committee. Of course we will cooperate with Judge Rouleau. That too is an ideal. I wonder when his party will accept their share of the responsibility for contributing to that illegal occupation.
For Charlesbourg, Saint-Charles. Well, Mr. Speaker, it seems that Pinocchio is the new pseudonym of the Minister of Public Safety. He recently made a statement in this House that is totally false. He said, "We invoked the Emergency Measures Act after receiving advice from law enforcement." But federal and municipal law enforcement confirmed that they never made that recommendation. And now he's talking nonsense and hoping Canadians will forget about the whole matter. My question, was he acting on his own or was he following the PM's orders? I'd like to remind members that we cannot do indirectly what we can't do directly. And when you do things indirectly that are not acceptable, as I said earlier, as I've said before, It's a problem, and so one ends up deserving being heckled. Well, Mr. Speaker, I've been very clear. We needed the Emergencies Act for public safety, and we will never apologize for doing what was necessary to protect Canadians. We did it for Canadians who wanted to go to work or bring their children to childcare. We invoked the Act for Canadians who, against their will, found themselves in the midst of this occupation. The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Well, I think the Minister has memory issues because on April 28th he said, "I recall my colleague and I having an exchange during the debate on the invocation of the Emergencies Act, which was only proposed after police officials told us that they needed this special power to ensure that they could restore public safety." But the RCMP says it never made such a request. The Minister deliberately misled the House. Was he following his Prime Minister's orders for fear of losing his cabinet position? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, with all due respect for my colleague, we invoked the Emergency Measures Act to protect Canadians. It was a necessary decision. And the RCMP Commissioner said that before a committee. Moreover, I would ask my colleague when the Conservatives will do something to apologize to Ottawa communities for the Conservative Party's responsibility for what happened. The interim Conservative Party leader encouraged these illegal blockades. It's extremely wrong. The Honourable Member. Let's keep examining what happened, Mr. Speaker. On May 2nd, the Minister said, on the recommendation of police, we invoked the Emergency Measures Act. During parliamentary committee hearings, he said that it was the RCMP that made the request because they needed the act to do their job. He has said this repeatedly over the past few months, and now to add insult to injury, he has the audacity to tell us that this whole thing is a simple misunderstanding. When will he finally admit the truth? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, we have been very clear on this side of the House about the fact that it was a necessary decision. And yes, we discussed the matter with police forces before the act was invoked. We asked for their advice, and we will continue to work closely with police forces in order to protect our communities. On the Conservative side of the House, their party actually contributed to the illegal blockades. It's very wrong, and they should do something to make Ottawa communities whole.
The Liberals insist that the police asked them to invoke the Emergency Measures Act. Police forces say they never asked. The Liberals insist that the act was needed in order to tow the trucks away, which is not the case, since all border blockades were resolved beforehand, and it was the province that leveraged the licenses of tow truck owners to get their cooperation. The allegations about Russian and foreign funding was false, and the accusations of arson were also false. So will the Prime Minister admit that invoking the Emergency Measures Act was just to punish those who don't agree with him?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague for the question. It allows me to highlight again that Commissioner Lucky herself testified before committee that indeed there was a problem procuring tow trucks in the midst of the illegal occupation, which is of course one of the reasons why we included that power in the Emergencies Act itself. We sought that advice prior to its invocation. We took the decision informed by our consultations, Mr. Speaker, and we did it because it was necessary, and we will never apologize for doing what is necessary to protect the health and safety of all Canadians. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Medicine Hat, Carson Warner.
Mr. Speaker, this Minister of Public Safety has repeatedly stated that the Emergencies Act was invoked at the recommendation of police. However, police officials have testified that they, in fact, did not ask for the invocation, and the Minister has not been able to identify any police agency that specifically asked for the act invocation, as he states. Canadians don't trust don't know what to believe anymore and don't trust this misunderstood minister and this government. Will the minister do the right thing and just admit he made it up, or will he continue to double down and lose what little credibility he has left?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as my colleague well knows, and as I have said on a number of occasions, we invoked the Emergencies Act because it was necessary. We consulted with law enforcement. We sought their advice prior to its invocation, Mr. Speaker, and that advice obviously informed the decision to invoke. We did it because Canadians were hurting, because as they were trying to get to work, as they were trying to go about their daily lives, Conservatives were encouraging them to say that was wrong, and just once it would be nice to hear Conservatives stand up and apologize for their improper, reckless role in extending the illegal blockades. While they were undermining public safety, we were defending it.
The honourable member for Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke.
Mr. Speaker, the Public Safety Minister said 9 times he invoked the Freeze and Seize Emergencies Act at the request of the police. The RCMP denied this. The acting Ottawa Police Chief denied this. And even the former Ottawa Police Chief denied this. How can Canadians trust this minister or his government?
Good question. Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians will trust a government that will do what is necessary to protect their health and safety, and contrast what we did, which was to invoke the Emergencies Act only after it was clear that existing authorities were ineffective at restoring public safety, to the role of the Conservatives, Mr. Speaker, who encouraged, who egged them on, who were taking selfies with them, who were doing whatever it took to make it a political problem for the Prime Minister. That was wrong. They should know better. Canadians will never forget the role that Conservatives played during the illegal blockades, but they will remember, Mr. Speaker, what we did, which was to protect them. Thank you.
The honourable member for Brantford Brant.
The Prime Minister promised Canadians they would expect openness and transparency, but it appears this is not the case with our Public Safety Minister. Words matter. Clarity matters. Repeating extensively inside and outside of this House that law enforcement asked for the Act is categorically opposed to the narrative that they asked for the measures contained in the Act. How can Canadians trust this minister when he has repeatedly misled them?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Speaker, the honourable colleague sets a very high threshold for openness and transparency. When is he going to shine a light on the statements that were made by his interim leader during the illegal occupations, who wanted to make it a political problem while frontline officers were trying to restore public safety? That party...
With all the shouting, I wasn't able to hear half that answer. I'm going to have to ask this minister to start over again, please.
Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, my honourable colleague across the aisle sets a very high threshold for openness and transparency, and I wonder when he's going to shine a light on the conduct of his own caucus colleagues, including the interim Conservative Party of Canada leader, who was egging on the illegal occupation long after it had become dangerous. Not only did those statements put at jeopardy the lives and the health and safety of Ottawa residents, it also put in danger the lives and safety of our frontline police officers. It was wrong. They should apologize.